Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eric Horvitz, Technical Fellow and Director of Microsoft Research Labs.
Thank you. And let me bring out my esteemed panel. Salom Barakis, Carla Gomes, Percy Liang, and Grija Ranade. Well, welcome to the panel on AI, People, and Society, where we'll be discussing questions and issues that are coming to the fore with challenges and opportunities at the intersection of AI, people, and society. Over the last decade, growing excitement about harnessing AI to empower, extend, and protect us has been tempered in many ways, by rising concerns about the potential rough edges and adverse outcomes, whether inadvertent or directed. Now, some folks fear the rise of superintelligences and the loss of control of AI systems. Other folks focus on expectations that AI advances will have influences that will be detrimental to our workforce, to labor, and will amplify inequity among people. On near-term issues, people are worried about rough edges with the concerns with fair, accountable, and transparent AI, the notions of there being deep biases buried in data sets that are leading to unfair inferences. Other concerns coming to the fore include legal and ethical issues with decisions made often in a split second by autonomous systems that make key trade-offs about sensitive issues and questions about whose utility function is represented in these systems, and shouldn't end users' preferences be represented in them. And on the front of civil liberties, we have groups like the ACLU and others raising concerns about rising threats to civil liberties via new forms of surveillance, or simply via the large-scale pursuit of data resources in accordance with building AI systems for various commercial goals. Those are just a few of many concerns, rough edges, and discussions being provoked by the successes we see in AI. We'll be discussing these questions and others. Let me introduce our panelists. Starting on my right is Grija Ranade. She's a researcher at Microsoft Research. She just became an MSR AI person, but she was formerly in the Adaptive Systems and Interaction Group and Theory Groups at our Redmond lab. Grija did her PhD work at UC Berkeley, did her undergraduate work at MIT, and her research interests include control of autonomous systems and safety issues around that, information theory, wireless communications, crowdsourcing, and other topics. To her left is Percy Liang, an assistant professor at Stanford University. Percy did his PhD also at Berkeley. He did his bachelor's also at MIT, maybe different classes, maybe. And his research interests, as many of you know from his contributions this week, include natural language semantics, developing machine learning methods that infer rich latent structures from limited supervision, an idea that's rising in importance, and we're getting some more competency in that space over time. He actually won the Ichkai Computers and Thought Award last year, Sloan Research Fellowship, and most importantly, at least for us, a Microsoft Research Faculty Fellowship a couple of years ago. Welcome, Percy. Next to Percy is Salom Barakis. Salom spent, we're very proud to say, a couple of years as a postdoc in our New York City lab, where he's provided leadership in the area of fairness, accountability, and transparent software, helping to stand up a whole community in this space, starting as a workshop and now a conference. He's also has been involved with the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton University, and he did his doctorate in media culture and communication at NYU, where he remains an affiliate of the Information Law Institute. And then Carla Gomes, to Salom's left, is professor of computer science and director of the Institute for Computational Sustainability at Cornell. We've known Carla for many years as a fabulous researcher in optimization, satisfiability. She's attacked some of the hardest problems in AI, some of those NP hard problems with interesting methods and heuristics and optimizations. And a few years ago, she became a leader in this whole realm of applying AI in material science and sustainability, in many areas that had not been touched by these methods before, and leads up an expedition that NSF funded to create a network of related researchers in computational sustainability. So we're going to basically just have 7-minute statements from each of our panelists, leaving time for questions and comments among ourselves on the stage here, as well as opening up to the audience, given this topic is an interesting one to many people, and there are lots of opinions, questions, concerns, and feelings about some of these issues. So let's start to my left with Girija.
Well, thanks, Eric. Thanks for the invitation to be here. So I wanted to bring up 2 different issues to the discussion today. And the first one is something that has gotten a lot of attention recently, especially following the recent US presidential election. And this is, of course, the fact that algorithms and bots can now influence public opinion and, be used to spread all kinds of propaganda. And we've seen the effect of this not just in the US, but also, for example, in the recent French election, or it was used to influence voting during the Brexit vote. And just to give you some examples of the kinds of stories that were circulated on social media during the US election, for example, there were stories with headlines such as, oh, Hillary sold weapons to ISIS, or Obama has banned the Pledge of Allegiance in schools. And these kind of stories on social media, I think, are something that's really important to think about. Of course, there's the implications that have gotten recent attention about Russian involvement, which makes people very interested. And it's not as though this kind of misinformation is new. It's been there all along. But what social media and the internet are now allowing is even people without access to large-scale television networks or publishing, printing presses, can influence thousands of opinions. And they can do this in an automated way and can target users using the same algorithms that we use for targeting ads to different people. So the question, of course, is, what can we do about this as a community, and how can we address the challenges that this brings up? And so the first question, of course, is, can we identify what we would think of as fake news or harmful information? And this becomes challenging given that, certain articles that we've looked at that are, we think of as fake news are often very strongly worded opinion pieces where there's nothing that is false that is actually written, but it's just strongly suggested. And then, in contrast, you have things like The Onion, which are known to be satire, so they're knowingly saying false things. Or you have breaking news in very reputable news outlets that is, not presented with a lot of evidence. So this suggests you want some kind of human labeling to be able to actually deal with the problem. But then as soon as you get human labeling, we all bring with us our own personal preferences and personal biases. And how do you prevent, for example, the same problem happening again where another malicious agent then automates the labeling so that now you label stories however you want just by having lots of agents? And once maybe you even identify these stories, there's a question of, well, what do you do about this? And I think this is something where the partnership on AI could play a very influential role by bringing together different large players in the space to come to a consensus on how we can identify harmful influences on our society without being worried about political bias or personal preferences. And I think maybe by working together on some of these issues, we might actually be able to present a unified front to be able to tackle some of these things. There's a bunch of work. I know that there's work in the NLP community, for example, that's being done to address this. Different platforms are coming up with different labeling strategies. But I think there's a bunch of interesting questions in this space that we need to think about. In particular, for example, you want to make sure that you're not in any way censoring free speech. So you would want to publish your algorithm for identifying fake news. But of course, this then incentivizes people to maybe game your system. So what are the trade-offs that we need to think about here? And in the last few minutes I actually wanted to kind of switch gears and talk about a second issue that I've been thinking a lot about. And this has to do with autonomous agents not in the online world, but in the physical world. And Barbara mentioned this, in the context of self-driving cars in her talk yesterday briefly. And this came up just a few weeks ago when I was visiting Kerry Park in a much smaller kind of baby way, where there was a huge tourist crowd, looking at the skyline and Mount Rainier. And suddenly someone launched a drone up into the air. And everyone's attention was diverted to the drone because they were curious what it was doing, but also because it was so overpowered by the gusts of wind that it was wildly going everywhere, and people started backing away from the railing because they were worried it was going to hit them in the face. And this brings up questions of, well, what is the responsibility of someone who is launching such a drone? And what kind of safety and stability guarantees should we as engineers be giving for these kinds of devices that are going to be released into uncertain environments? They might not behave according to the models that they were certified under. The environment might not be according to specification. What kind of fail-safe methods do we need to have when our expected specifications are not met for the conditions? And I think there's a wide set of interesting questions that we need to think about here, both on some of the liability side, but also just the technical challenges I think are incredibly interesting. I think maybe Percy wants to build on some of that, and we can go from there. But
I guess that's a cue, Percy.
I guess so. Yeah, you still have 55 seconds.
You can take them.
Yeah. So building on Girija's point, first, I'm really happy to be here, so thank you, Eric, for inviting me. So building on the idea of kind of reliability of AI systems, I want to make, I guess, a few comments about that. So it's very clear today that AI has kind of gone from kind of what I call kind of in vitro to kind of in vivo, in the sense that when I was still in grad school, we would write papers and we would kind of do these experiments, but it was much more of an academic pursuit. And these days, yesterday we heard Harry Shum talk about how AI really should be everywhere, and all the Microsoft products are going to have AI in them. So the pervasiveness of AI in the real world, I think, actually raises some really interesting challenges and also opportunities for research. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the security angle. Earlier today, there was an excellent breakout session on security. So many of these comments will be kind of echoing some of the discussion there. And I guess the high-level way to think about it is that a lot of the culture and kind of progress in AI has been about, okay, we build something and then we see what it does, and we recognize this is good. But I think security actually kind of requires a very different mindset. It's not about kind of what's happening now, but it's about what could possibly happen. And we all know that kind of security by being very reactive instead of kind of proactive is kind of a recipe that doesn't work very well. So I want to point out two types of kind of attacks that I think are kind of interesting. One are these adversarial examples, which many of you probably have seen. So the concrete, I think maybe this was 4 years ago, Ian and colleagues, Ian Goodfellow and colleagues had a paper showing how you take a state-of-the-art object recognition system, it classifies an image correctly, and then you can add imperceptible changes to this image, causing the classifier to break down and with high confidence and classify on the school bus as an ostrich, for example. And this is, and so that's fine, but what's actually more interesting is that they show that this was kind of very robust to variations in data set, variations in models, transferred against different models. You didn't even need the model at all, only need black box access. And so it seems like actually kind of a fundamental problem that we've kind of exposed, which offers a lot of kind of research opportunities. One thing that's kind of interesting is that there's been a lot of papers on showing I can defend against this, and then another paper saying, no, you can't. Here's an attack. Actually, recently, earlier on July 12th, there was an archive paper that came out saying, no need to worry about adversarial examples for autonomous driving. And then 5 days later, there was a blog post out of OpenAI showing that, well, actually, here's some bunch of examples that actually break all the assumptions. So the assumption was that if you got images from different viewpoints, you would be safe. But it turns out that's not safe either. So I think this kind of reactive mode is limiting in some ways, and I think it's a kind of an open challenge to the research community how to build these systems on greater foundation, more reliable foundation. A related type of attack is data poisoning attacks, which are even a bit more kind of troublesome in some ways. So these are when attacker is able to inject or modify training examples, not the test examples. And from a security point of view, this is kind of interesting because usually you think of security as you're trying to keep people out. You just keep people out and then you're good. But the way that machine learning works is that you have to let data in, right? The main resource that a lot of the big platforms have is that the users provide data, and that's kind of the key driver. So now you kind of have this tension of how do you keep only the good data but not the bad data. So I think there's a bunch of interesting things there. So a little bit about reliability, which goes back to, I think, Gurij's point, is that even when you're not dealing with adversary, I think there are cases where errors, maybe it's nature, and you assume that nature isn't against you, but the stakes are so high that you kind of want to be careful. So this is there's work by Michael Kurgendorfer from Stanford who works on kind of aircraft collision avoidance systems. And if you fly on a plane, I think you're suspect to his software. But recently he found that deep neural networks actually do really well at predicting whether two aircrafts are going to collide or not. And this might give you, the community, some pause because we know that these models sometimes can be a little bit difficult to understand. So he's been developed with others at Stanford, developing tools to actually formally verify properties of these networks. So I think that's kind of, those type of things are interesting. And I guess a final remark is on the idea of control. I mean, I guess in a different sense than when you mentioned it, is if we think we're building systems with certain behaviors, and the whole mantra of machine learning is that the behaviors are defined in the data. So whereas before you might have had kind of a more, if you had a rule or some sort of declarative way to specify something, you could maybe have direct access. But if it's in the data, we now need to build tools to actually be able to change the behavior according to what you want in the data. And so with that, I'll stop since my time is up.
Okay, thank you, Percy. Salon.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a privilege to be back. It's been 2 weeks since I have left Microsoft, and so it's a nice occasion to come back. So actually, I'll try to build a little bit on what Percy just said. And a way I've thought about this, which is maybe a little bit too cute, is that in some cases, machine learning has turned out to be too human in the sense that it sort of reflects and reproduces a lot of the deficiencies and problems with human reasoning. And then in other cases, it's insufficiently human. We don't really understand the way that it reasons, and so it makes it hard for us to understand what's going on or feel comfortable with it. And so I'll start with the first and then try to move on to the second. So in what way is machine learning potentially too human? And I think what Percy was just mentioning at the end is an example of that, which is, we're training often on documented cases of human behavior, especially when we're trying to make important decisions in these high consequence areas like employment, security, credit, all these domains which were often really complex bureaucratic procedures that involve some degree of automation, but increasingly stand to be pretty significantly revolutionized by machine learning. And I think people have been rightfully pretty enthusiastic about the potential benefits this will have, not just in terms of accuracy and efficiency, but also in advancing financial inclusion, improving civil rights, all these kinds of issues. But what people have discovered is that because we're often learning from history, from past examples, these systems are very vulnerable to inheriting a lot of the problems that we are documented in these examples. And so this has become a really, I think, pressing problem, and this concern around bias in machine learning has, in a pretty short number of years, I think, become a pretty widely accepted and recognized issue that has invited a lot of researchers to try to tackle it. But it's a difficult problem. And I would say that the kind of research field has bifurcated at this point, and I'll just try to explain the bifurcation to show. So there's a lot of theory work which is focused on the fact that maybe our models that we build are doing really, really well for the majority of the population, but maybe don't do terribly well for the minority population. And so the aggregate reported accuracy of performance overall might seem great, but if you actually separate out how the model is performing for different parts of the population, what you realize is that some population is just being assessed much less accurately than another, right? And that alone might just be a first analysis that should encourage us to ask why is that the case, and people are thinking about those types of situations. In fact, what Eric was mentioning at the start of the day yesterday about this ProPublica story involving the recidivism prediction tool was an example of this, where the tool was sort of making errors in different ways. It was making more false positives for black defendants and more false negatives for white defendants. And it was just the disparity in the rates at which these errors were being made that actually led people to sort of wonder, like, is this actually fair? Despite the fact that you might be able to say that the reported accuracy, so the true positive and true negative rate, was comparable, right? So this is inviting us to think a little bit more deeply about if we disaggregate these metrics, do we actually discover that there's some unevenness here along the lines of race and gender and these other protected characteristics. But separate from that is this even more pernicious problem where sometimes we don't even know that our models are actually doing a worse job for some part of the population because we have a sampling bias, or because the actual examples encode past discrimination. So an example I give of this is, if you want to train a model to predict who will be a productive employee, we might use past examples of employee performance as recorded in their annual review, right? So we assign a score to people at the end of the year. We look at the features associated with that particular person, and we try to find other people with those features that correlate with the high score. But if that score was assigned, if the label that was given to the example was done in a prejudicial or biased way, we actually don't even know what the ground truth is. Instead, what we have is this highly biased set of examples, which the machine will take as true, and so our evaluation will not reflect the fact that the predictions it's making don't actually correctly predict how the people will perform. What it's correctly predicting is how they will be labeled prejudicially by a human. Right? So there's all these really tricky problems in that case where it's not even necessarily obvious when we're making these kinds of errors. And it's a less tractable, less structured problem, and that also is a really, I think, important area of work. So in the remaining time, I'll just shift to this other point, which is that maybe a different issue is that we just don't even understand how these systems work. Maybe we don't see them as actually following the same kinds of heuristics that humans might, so that it actually makes it difficult for us to have any intuitions about whether the decision was made in a fair way. And so there's a growing awareness of this looming regulation in Europe called the General Data Protection Regulation. The thing that this community has become particularly sensitive to is this requirement, which has been sort of dubbed a right to explanation. I just want to say that it's actually worth noting that there are existing legal requirements in the United States that require explanations. So there are laws that actually govern credit decisions. And if you apply for a loan, I doubt anyone in this room had this happen to them, but if you apply for a loan and you get rejected, the creditor, the lender, actually needs to tell you why. There's a legal requirement to explain. And this requirement has actually structured the industry quite quite significantly, such that a lot of the more sophisticated machine learning techniques that we talk about here are not widely used in industry, precisely because it makes it difficult to produce these kinds of explanations. But I think it also prompts us to ask what we want to get out of these explanations. Why do we want explanations? A common response to this is that why should we have expectations of being explained a decision by a model when we don't really even have that with human decision making? And I think the answer there is that we have really developed institutions for when important decisions are made such that people actually have to justify them, right? So it may be that humans' justification for their decisions are only loosely related to the actual reasoning that led to that determination. But we, as humans, have intuitions about that, right? We have ways of trying to probe and get a sense about whether or not this person is in fact given us a satisfactory answer. And in cases of legal decisions, it doesn't even really matter what the reasoning was in the judge's head. It actually just matters what's produced in the stated written document, because that is what will be debated at a higher court, right? So there's really important values involved in making and offering explanations, but we need to ask whether those things are those are the right mechanisms to defend and vindicate the values we really care about, when it might be less about trying to inform someone about how do you change something to get the credit, than it is about ensuring that these models are fair, that are not discriminating. And I just want to end by saying that a lot of the work that's been done on trying to deal with the problems of bias in machine learning can themselves be a way of ensuring and certifying that these models actually meet some kind of formal definition of fairness, which might be a more effective way of getting at these questions than explanation.
Thank you, Salon. Carla.
Well, this is a very exciting time for AI. AI is, permeating our lives, revolutionizing our lives, and we have, self-driving cars. We have automated speech recognition. So clearly, AI is benefiting dramatically society, and is benefiting dramatically business companies, etc. My concern is that maybe we are not doing enough we are not using AI for addressing other concerns, such as the sustainability of our planet. So, over the last 10, 15 years, I have, immersed and I've been deeply involved in nurturing a new field. Eric mentioned that, the field of computational sustainability. And the big picture is that we should harness AI and computer science techniques to address key challenge, sustainability challenge, and challenge concerning sustainable development. And there are many opportunities where we can actually make a big difference. We have, I thought I would give you some examples of how we can really have a tremendous impact. For example, as you know, since the Industrial Revolution, the reduction in biodiversity has been dramatic. And so, for example, we have, collaborating with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, they have, this incredible program for citizen science, eBird, where anybody can contribute to submit bird observations, and using AI techniques, using machine learning, we have now very detailed models of how species distributions and bird distribution models that really allow us to use fundamentally new ways of doing conservation. For example, the Nature Conservancy is using these detailed models to protect birds against the drought, migrating birds in California, by basically creating these reverse auctions where farmers are paid to keep water in the rice fields, providing habitat for birds when they are migrating. And this is only possible because we are using these, sophisticated models, the same way Wall Street uses sophisticated models to predict when birds are migrating and creating habitat for birds. So this is an example. But another area where I think AI can really make a big difference is in terms of scientific discovery. For example, we are working with the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis at Caltech to accelerate the discovery of new materials for renewable energy, in particular for solar fuel. Solar fuels are, promising because we can store the solar fuels, and this is actually very exciting for AI because we want to use our machine learning models to, for example, a key problem is how can we infer crystal structures from X-ray diffraction patterns, and this is a problem that is similar to topic modeling, except here we need to obey the laws of physics. So you need to reason and infer these complex physical constraints, and so your solutions have to be lead to physically meaningful interpretations of your data. And this is a challenge for machine learning. So I think this is an exciting topic, and in fact, for example, using an AI system that we deployed at Caltech, and it's also at the synchrotron, our collaborators have been able to discover new solar light observers. So I think there are, I wanted to emphasize a bit a more positive note. Of course, there are many concerns, and we need to address, including, for example, unemployment. Automation leads to unemployment, so we need to think about solutions, and AI can play a big role, but also I think it is a societal issue that we may need to think of new ways to address this challenge. But my big message is that we can use AI for a better world.
Great. Well, thank you, Carla. We're going to just open it up to questions now and discussion. I'll start by just proposing an opportunity to Salon. Let's say a large consortium of companies, IT companies, and NGOs and nonprofits working together wants to develop a best practice for how classifiers are fielded and maybe tested for fairness before they're put out in the world. And they come to you and they say, well, what should we do?
Yeah, so it's interesting because this is actually something that a lot of regulatory bodies are also considering. And so it's probably a good idea that industry itself is considering this with the input from other stakeholders. I think that the problems are not yet so fully understood that it would make sense to say that if you meet this threshold, you're in the clear. I think at this point it makes much more sense to say that there's some floor that you should at least try to meet. And it doesn't guarantee that you'll avoid any kind of problems in the future, but that this is considered best practice, and you really should try to at least get to that point. And I think there's a lot of stuff that actually, I think what this reveals is that there's a lot of issues around safety and reliability that are very similar to questions of fairness, right? They're sort of about thinking very carefully about how your model is going to perform in real circumstances, trying to do a good job of considering like the training data you're using to actually develop these models. Things that I think people are already pretty well attuned to, but you could give it a special kind of inflection by making it also not just about reliability generally, but about making sure that it's reliable along these lines that really matter given historical inequities in society. So I think to the degree that we can already provide that kind of guidance that really probably resonates with frontline engineers, I think that would be enormously helpful, even if that doesn't mean that like you're in the clear for any kind of legal issues you might encounter despite your best efforts.
I know when I read that ProPublica piece, I couldn't get past the sense that this data set being used across North America was derived from data from one city. I said, forget about everything else. I said, how could that possibly, in medicine, you would never do such a thing. And even though that wasn't even mentioned as a big issue in the article. So that was just a comment there on best practices. Any questions from the audience or comments? People are just in stunned silence. We have one over here, I think. Is that Burton?
Yeah, we got a mic there. Should I just talk loud?
Burton, you're known to not need a microphone. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. It struck me as interesting about the problem of bad learning by artificial intelligences. We have an example of this in the movie literature. The most famous artificial intelligence that most people know on the planet is named Pinocchio. And Pinocchio had a conscience named Jiminy Cricket, who continued to train the artificial intelligence in morality and right thinking and all sorts of other stuff while he was running around in the world. Why don't we do something like, we do that with our children too, of course. Why don't we do something like that with the artificial intelligences that we deploy for fun and profit?
No, are you, just to clarify, Burton, are you saying that the Jiminy Cricket module is also AI, but somehow it's a really good, respectable, trustworthy AI system?
I think Jiminy Cricket is trustworthy because, have you ever noticed Jiminy Cricket seems to know everything but never changes his mind or has any sort of insight. It's just the way things are.
But the archival video.
Exactly. You just shut off Jiminy's ability to learn new things. And that way, Jiminy stays trustworthy as an advisor to Pinocchio about the eternal verities. I'm just wondering whether we ought to get a little more creative about layers of things, including layers of meaning, by the way. Layers of, well, this is true because that is true because that is true because we learned it that way in layers from whatever trained us, person or other AI.
So I think that's a really nice point, and I think we are seeing to some degree AI is evolving in this direction. And the first example that came to mind when you brought up the two AIs competing against each other was actually the generative adversarial networks, where you basically have one network that is trying to fool the other network, and the other network that is putting the first network kind of back in its place. And we're seeing a lot of really cool things that are emerging as a result of this. And I feel like it's only kind of the start of something that's going to be much bigger. So I think it's a really cool idea, and I do hope that there'll be much more work building on this.
There's been also rising discussion about this idea of a meta-level reasoner that watches over things and has some simple rules it looks for, simple problems it looks for. And there's a field called runtime verification, RV, which has come to the fore with ideas that, look, you can't, this complicated thing we're relying on, we had to build because it's sophisticated, we can't really verify this thing, but we can verify a monitor that could look at this thing and at least watch for out of bounds. And that kind of thing might be, or inbounds. Ed, you here? Oh, yeah, someone over there? Go first. Yeah, I got to follow protocol here. Go ahead. Thanks.
Kishore Ramachandran, Georgia Tech. I just wanted to point out that Jerry Salzer, in his 1974 seminal paper on security and privacy, pointed out that the goal of a secure system should not be to prevent all violations, because it's just not possible to know all the violations that are possible. And so the panel that Percy was mentioning about the security, in AI, one of the things that came out was the fact that we don't really understand how the AI program is producing the results that it's producing. And therefore, given that setting, how can you even think about how to build secure AI systems? Because we don't know what the correct behavior should be. We may not all know all the correct behaviors. And so how do we know whether when things are happening, there are violations of the correct behavior? That's exactly what Jerry also was cautioning against, that if you know that there are violations happening, you can detect it and try to build techniques for that. But with AI systems, how do you do that? Is that something that the panel can address?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. I think there's always a gap between kind of theory, what you can prove, and what's happening in reality. I think with AI systems, there's a kind of a greater gap because a lot of machine learning is based on kind of induction. You kind of have to take this leap of faith, which means that you can't always just fall back to certain principles. So I'm writing down this optimization problem and I can solve it. Therefore, I trust the results as long as the solver is kind of verified and correct. But this induction leads to problems like what is the inductive bias, and this gets to issues of kind of bias that Sloan was mentioning. And I think this is still very kind of early, in the kind of intersection between AI and security. I think one of the great things to move forward with is having the two communities talk to each other more, because I think there could be kind of additional structure inside kind of these AI models that could be kind of made more secure. And whether it be kind of just verifying or trying to understand existing models, or finding a kind of a different class of models which might even work better. So one of the interesting things that one notes is that when someone tries to make their systems secure so let's say adversarial training against adversarial examples, it actually produces more accurate models in some cases. And so it might be the case that having a stronger bar actually can increase a variety of different objectives.
Over here, and then we have Ed over here, so people
Okay.
can dial down here.
Hello, I'm Pablo Paredes from Stanford. So I'm actually wanting to challenge the panel with the notion of, we've been talking about sustainability. What about the sustainability of AI itself? Because I think there are two fundamental fuels that AI depend on. One is data, and the other one is talent. And I think the data sets, so far, it's been very opportunistic. You have all these data sets, and you go and work on them. And what about generating data sets that really matter? Just generating data sets is not a trivial problem. Like, should we work on actually sustaining the growth of AI by creating the right data sets, not just finding data sets that are lying out there? And the second one, talent, is lots of AI talent is going to go to make one more advertisement being delivered at the right person making more sense for the same institution. Why don't we get more talent working in the right problems with the right data sets? So are we actually working on the sustainability of AI from that point of view?
Yeah. Comments, anybody?
I can talk a little bit
Go ahead.
about the data sets. Someone can take the second part. So it's a very good point that a lot of the progress in AI has been fueled by these data sets. I mean, where would computer vision be if, or deep learning for that matter, if ImageNet hadn't been around? And I think traditionally, at least in machine learning, data sets haven't really gotten as much kind of people create data sets haven't gotten as much credit traditionally, because the emphasis was on what is the secret sauce, what is the algorithm or the model that's going to make it work. But I do feel like things are changing, especially in this era where people, I think, realize the importance of these data sets, and at least in kind of vision and NLP, people have been creating a lot of different, finding creative ways to create a lot of different data sets. And every time that happens, there's often kind of, progress being made. It is worth thinking about, whether one should kind of just work on data sets which happen to be there and are expedient, or whether one cares about finding particular types of problems that we really believe we should work on, for example, in sustainability, or maybe something that involves fake news or security, and maybe with more of an incentive to create data sets, people actually step into these data scarce areas.
Ed?
I could.
Oh, sorry, Teresa.
I could answer the second address.
That's right.
Try and
That was
address
a nice multi-part question.
the second aspect. It
Yes.
just reminded me of one of the undergraduates I was working with when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. She came to me after I was teaching a class, and she said, you know, I really like what you're doing, and I want to work with you, but I'm a chemistry major, and I am going to be a chemistry major because I don't want a job where all I'm going to do is sell ads. And so computer science is boring and useless, and I don't want to study it, and I want to study chemistry. So I just wanted to bring this up to say that I think that students are a great conscience, and they are often really good at pointing you know, people in the right kind of direction. And so I'm personally not super worried about people just wanting to sell more ads. And I was really excited also to hear Barbara's discussion yesterday about her class around ethics. And I've heard many discussions of these new classes coming up at various universities around the country. And I think having these discussions in academic circles, as well as forums like this, is a really great way to make us all accountable to each other and make sure we're on track. If we cannot even hold a panel like this, then you know we know that we're seriously going off where we want to be.
Maybe can I just make a comment? Sure. About the data sets, you know, that is quite a very interesting topic. And I do think that our community tends to, you know, undervalue how difficult it is to build, you know, good data sets. And just, you know, for you to explain this point, you know, like my experience working on a variety of, you know, sustainability problems like bird conservation or, for example, now we started a major effort to, you know, understand the impacts of hydropower dams in Amazon. They plan to build over 500 dams in the next 10, 15 years. You know, and for us to even understand the problems, it takes, even formulate and pose the questions takes a long time. And often, you know, I think our community really does not appreciate all the work that is required to formulate a problem, to you know, collect the data, to curate the data, and you know, that is an important part of our research. And actually, I think for us to have impact, we really need to interact with you know, the different domain experts, and it is a process. And you know, all these putting together data sets, it is very valuable. And I for example, when I was chairing this, we created a computation sustainability track for AAAI, and we also created actually a track for dataset papers, because that is, important, and that's a way actually to grow the community. But sometimes I think computer science really don't appreciate that even putting together a data set is a challenge. How to address, try not to have biased data, etc. So I think we should really appreciate that a little more.
Okay, thanks, Carla. Ed.
So, as we all know, Elon Musk shut off his mouth about AI again on Saturday. And I'm interested in what you think the community, the computing research community, not just the AI community, can do about this. There are a set of serious issues: bias in training data, workforce displacement, things like that. And it seems to me this alarmism detracts attention from the serious issues. It's not like Eric's Tesla is going to get together with its comrades in the Costco parking lot and decide to turn on us. Okay? I wonder how we suppress the alarmism without acting like Pollyannas, because there are some serious issues here.
Well, just to respond, Ed, I mean, I did see that yesterday, and we did have folks across Microsoft send notes around and saying, well, what does this mean? How should we react on our policy people and so on? Because these statements are taken very seriously by the public when someone says, I know how these things work, I have deep access, and I'm worried.
This is the National Governors Association.
I understand. You know, my first reaction is I felt like, you know, I want to engage with Elon and get down to brass tacks and details. What's the trajectory we're thinking about? What is meant by AI, which is a broad set of subdisciplines? You might say that I'm really worried about computer science. We need some regulatory activity about computer science. And so I think it takes coming down to details and engaging, actually, rather than saying these people are off their rockers. And that's been my approach, is to try to understand in detail, because well, folks are genuine. They have genuine concerns, and we might be educated by them, and hopefully they would be educated by the discussion and by others. So I don't know, other comments?
I'm happy to chime in too. So I mean, I think the sort of justification for this line of reasoning when it's academic is that even if this is like a marginally small risk, that it justifies maybe some small group of people actually devoting their time to thinking about it. But that's quite different than when you have these important figures in the field who are speaking, I think, to you know, policymakers. And so I think there's certainly room for this kind of range of concerns, academically speaking, but I think we want to make sure that the people who are in front of policymakers or regulators don't sort of push the issue entirely to this extreme kind of existential risk questions to the exclusion of these much more near-term and immediate things, which maybe don't generate the same kind of press fascination, but are clearly like very serious issues that will have profound consequences for people's immediate lives. So.
Yeah, number 3 over here. Yeah, who's that?
Philip Cranbull from UT Austin. So what do you think, if we continue in the same trajectory we're going right now, do you think AI is going to make our world a happier place? And if not, what should we do about it?
One discussion we had yesterday as we were getting the panel to get together was to reflect that sometimes we don't think about the problems with the default world today. You know, for example, there are about 1,000 people per reports and studies dying in hospitals every day in the US alone because of avoidable human error. 100 people, nearly 100 on the highways every day in the US alone, 1.2 million deaths per year around the world for by driving cars. It's not that the default world is perfect, so we can't, you know, afford to think deeply about possibilities of introducing even errorful systems that might make things a lot better. This is a comment we were discussing earlier. Like, what are the ethics of going too slow with AI per translating into reality systems we already know how to build? That's one reaction, but I want to turn it over to the panel to react. The question was, we'll be happier as human beings.
I guess generally I'm optimistic, but I guess it's not for free, right? It's not that if we just not worry about things, you know, things will go the way we want, I think. But I think if we take a lot of these issues that we've been, you know, raising, you know, seriously, like, you know, security, transparency, and these things, then I do believe that, you know, based on kind of Eric's earlier comments, that there's a lot of things that we can improve. Now, I guess it's the onus is on us as researchers, and also on, I guess, people, our kind of communication efforts with, you know, the policymakers to kind of make that happen. But so it's a kind of a conditional yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that this sort of provokes the question of, like, what do we mean by happy, or who is defining happy, right? And I think a lot of the questions that people have, even these extreme existential risk questions, are sort of about the imprecise definition of happiness that then lends itself to this, like, disaster situation. So, you know, I think another way of thinking about that, though, is that there are a lot of politics involved, frankly, in the metric we're trying to optimize, right? And if we don't decide this in a democratic way, or we don't do it precisely and carefully, without a lot of thought given to many possible implications, then that's a problem. And so I think I think it can really be a force for good, but I think we need to actually think exactly of what happiness means here and for whom, right? So.
Yeah, Bart. Oh, it's Raj.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I thought you were Bart today. Okay.
Well, his hand was over your head, raised also.
Okay.
So pass the mic back when you're done.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to get back to this previous question about this whole existential risk aspects. I do think, I really like the way Ed put it. I pretty much almost said similar things to some reporter asking me about these issues. I think it's okay for a few people to be worried about this, but it's important for us to point out to the to the outsiders that the technical community is not at all obsessed about this, and in fact, there's been very little traction, for these kinds of worries. It's just that, outsiders basically think Elon Musk is writing lots of papers in AI, and that he really understands everything about AI, and it is kind of as much of a 47.5 million Twitter followers he has. We do need to do our part to make sure that the world at large understands that it's just his personal opinion, and that in fact, if there was some sort of a worry that we shared, there would have been a lot more traction. Partnership for AI has thematic pillars. Not a single one is about existential risk.
Well, number one is.
What?
Number one is. To be honest, it's basically, it's understand it's safety critical AI.
Yeah, but
and you can imagine that
risk as so I think it is important for us to kind of point that out. Otherwise, the oxygen would be sucked out of the room, and these kinds of discussions, which are actually about important impacts of AI, would just nobody is interested. If we're all going to die anyway, pretty ugly deaths, then why care about bias and all this nonsense,
Okay. On that note, Bart.
Great point. Is this on?
Yeah.
So, my question is more, I'm involved in some of the AI safety research. I wonder whether there's a certain risk that we in the community, our communities, think that we can solve these problems. Like for example, problems in bias. You mentioned the parole decision programs and using biased data. There are actually a lot of issues there that are actually, I think, beyond AI researchers and involve more people who've thought about ethics, who've thought about policy, who've thought about other fields, economics, things about inequality, for example. I wonder whether there's a certain risk that as machine learning researchers, we're going to solve these bias problems, and that we actually are fooling ourselves a little bit, that we should bring in actually a broader set of experts, because I really believe that some of these problems are not really technical problems.
Right. So no one on the stage, I think, said that this should be a computer science only course. So comments on the interdisciplinary nature of the work.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that that it has been remarkable how much interest has kind of quickly grown around these questions within the technical community alone. And it does seem a little scary that much of the work has sort of run off without the involvement of a larger community. What I will point out, though, is that there's been interesting things that have come out of the technical work that have opened up new policy discussions, actually. So you might think that this is just in desperate need of long, millennia of history from ethics, right? That the community would just benefit from the other disciplines who've thought about this forever. But there's been a lot of positive outcomes for that community as well by having people think very formally, actually, about these problems and put a very fine point on some ambiguous thinking and sort of very amorphous points that have been left purposefully unaddressed in the law, often because they reflect political disagreement. Right? What is fairness? It's not just an ethical thing, it's a political thing. And the reason we don't actually resolve once and for all what it is because it reflects different political beliefs. And so what has been really interesting, I think, is that interaction where the technical community can actually really make us think much, much more carefully and precisely about these things, which then also will, I hope, invite in other people as well.
So I'd like to end with a little challenge problem for the panel that I didn't mention earlier. It's kind of a pop surprise reflection I'll ask you to do. So I think it's pretty clear, we probably all would agree, that there will be surprises in this field. 25 years from now, looking back, we'll be able to say, well, that surprised me, and that was a surprise. And I'll start with Carla and go down the line here. Just tell me, it's 25 years from now, you're looking back, and I ask you, future Carla, future Salon, Percy, Giriza, what surprising thing happened that we hadn't really been thinking about with how machine intelligence, with how AI folded with people in society, good or bad? I mean, adverse outcome or just fabulous for the happiness metric we're talking about over here. So just either one, and if you want to just think about it longer and say, I have no answer right now, that's fine too, because it's a pop question.
Yeah, it is a well, I maybe related to the previous comment, I think we will have fundamentally different ways of, addressing societal issues and, for example, automation. I think automation for us to address the reality, potential in employment. I hope, and I hope we have, different notions of, basic income and so different models of society.
So long, please. So again, it's 25 years from now. You're looking back. I interview you. What really was a big surprise here?
I mean, I think there is a positive future here, even for the issues that have concerned me, where these things really are a way to overcome very long-standing and well-understood problems of human bias and sort of the very poor heuristics we rely on to make super important decisions all the time. And so I can imagine with care and thought that a lot of these decisions are significantly improved to the benefit of often the most marginalized or disadvantaged people in society. But I also could imagine at the same time, even while that's happening, for inequality to actually just become much, much more severe, where the distribution of wealth in society is like further exacerbated, not because AI is unique in being able to do that, but just because it's sort of feeding into an existing way in which that has already happened. And so I just think many things can happen simultaneously where civil rights can be advanced even while, as Carla was saying, we find ourselves in a situation of growing economic inequality.
So I think often some of the surprises that you get with predicting the future is not kind of where the technology will land, but how people end up using it. For example, the internet was, I guess, is a good example of, okay, well, we can, in 1980 or 90 or something, you can imagine, okay, what if we had all the computers, connected? But somehow that kind of misses the point of how it really kind of just changes the way people interact with each other and, communicate. And I think, we can project out to the future. I think, there will be definitely a lot more AI kind of embedded in our daily lives. I think the machine-human interaction that has been kind of a theme of that has come up several times at this summit is going to be almost fade into the background because you won't even notice some of these things, and that will, and I think the newer generation is going to. I mean, it's kind of amazing watching some kids kind of interact with these technologies. It's you feel like you're on a different planet or something. And so I think it's going to have a lot of dramatic changes in the way that people even kind of behave and interact with each other.
Thanks. Giriza, wrap it up.
I guess I'll build on what the other panelists have said. I think it's really interesting to think about how we will change culturally thanks to AI. For example, is this notion of traveling to a foreign country and not speaking the language and stumbling through this interaction going to no longer be an issue because we'll all walk around with a translator app in our pocket, Does this mean that our language skills are going to atrophy the way like basic addition has atrophied with the introduction of calculators? And I hope that this means that actually basic education for all of us will mean basic programming skills and basic computer science will become really kind of at the forefront, because this will be necessary for every citizen to really understand what's going on, and hopefully we'll all end up being in a closer place with or bridging the inequalities as opposed to exacerbating them. That would be the hope.
Well, thanks to all of our panel members, we ended exactly on time. Thanks.